Greetings. This is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I would like to articulate a major change in my views on war. It is a change that occurred gradually over the course of several years and culminated in my present position, which I will not hesitate to articulate before going into my reasons. Namely, that position is that I no longer consider war to be acceptable by any parties, against any parties, for any stated or actual justification. My views certainly did not start in this fashion. Indeed, I supported the United States occupation of Afghanistan beginning in 2001. I supported the United States occupation of Iraq beginning in 2003. I believed that both of these occupations, unlike indeed most wars in history, were entered into out of self-defense, were directed toward heinous, brutal, violent, oppressive, totalitarian regimes that did not deserve to exist, and also had at least the potential of greatly increasing the degree of freedom and the standard of living of individuals in Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, I was also very pleased, and I still am very pleased, that the Taliban regime in Afghanistan is no longer in power. I am very pleased that Saddam Hussein is dead, because truly this was a monstrous human being. And I do not hesitate to maintain that evil, tyrannical regimes that oppress their own people and that threaten others throughout the world do not deserve to exist. However, my change in view is particularly targeted toward the aspect of war as a proper means of achieving this. I no longer believe that that is the case. The change in my views certainly did not occur overnight. I originally expected the occupations to be quite brief, essentially a matter of deposing the heinous regimes in question, perhaps restoring some basic order and stability, and then pulling out. Of course, a more thorough study of history would have indicated the contrary. The United States still has troops in Korea. It still has troops in Japan, many, many decades after the conflicts in Korea and in Japan completely subsided. So perhaps if history is any guide, because of the United States occupation in Afghanistan and Iraq, our politicians have perhaps inadvertently, perhaps intentionally committed us to decades of a significant military presence in two other areas of the world. Several years into each of these occupations, despite significant initial successes by the U.S. military, I kept reading news reports of continuing conflicts against various groups of insurgents and terrorists, resurgence of opposition to the U.S. occupation, continual chaos in these countries, and I was realizing that the occupations had been mismanaged. And my initial thought was, well, it's just an issue of bad management in the particular case, that if someone more competent had been in charge of these occupations, perhaps they could have been done more effectively. So the initial temptation, and I think many individuals who tracked these occupations via the news had this temptation, is simply to say that the problem lies in the particulars. And yet, there are many instances where advocates of free markets criticize not particular aspects of certain kinds of government initiatives, but the whole idea of a particular kind of government initiative. I think most people today recognize that there are severe problems within the public school system. And most people will also say, well, it's due to a host of case-specific insufficiencies. For instance, underpaid teachers, crowded classes, bad parenting, bad cultural upbringing. One could name perhaps tens, if not hundreds, of these little causes. But a principled opponent of the public education system will say the entire problem is with the whole premise of public education. That is, the whole premise of compulsorily herding young children into classrooms comprised entirely of their peers, rather than the natural way of educating them, which is in the presence of individuals who can actually teach them something, as opposed to their peers, among whom they will most likely likely simply be reduced to the lowest common denominator. Of course, as long as people are compelled to attend schools and compelled to pay for the schools that the government provides, there are going to continue to be disputes about what should be taught, about what the desired methods of teaching it ought to be, and there will continue to be problems that arise as a result of trying to fit everybody into a particular mold that happens to be decided upon as the outcome of the political process. Education might work if it were left entirely up to the decisions of private citizens, where some would make good decisions, some would make bad decisions, but not everybody would be affected by the failures of one particular system. For more on this topic, please see my video and essay, Commonly Misunderstood Concepts, Education. This concept of public education, irrespective of the particulars, and certainly many sets of particulars have been tried, both left-wing approaches to public education and right-wing approaches to public education, say under the No Child Left Behind bill, or recently with the completely insane reforms proposed by the Texas School Board, have failed and will fail dramatically. I would allege that war, like public education, is one of those kinds of government initiatives that is going to fail dramatically, irrespective of who manages it, for what ostensive or actual purpose it is being conducted, and the myriad particulars of the situation. So in Iraq and Afghanistan, it seemed to me that the stated justification for each of these occupations was among the most virtuous in human history. And indeed, the regimes against which these occupations were conducted were among the most heinous and vicious in all of human history. And yet those occupations have failed miserably. And one indication that they have failed miserably is that they are still continuing, that the problems within those two countries have not abated, and that American troops continue to die, and indeed the civilians in those countries also continue to die. My doubts about the validity of the occupations themselves began with the 2008 Ron Paul campaign for President of the United States. Representative Paul is certainly an extremely persuasive, intelligent, and articulate individual, and one of his stated positions I initially thought seemed to conflict with the rest of his platform. And that position, in my mind at the time, was his very principled and very strong opposition to the various foreign occupations that the United States was engaged in. At the time, I thought that because Dr. Paul was so impressively in accord with my thinking on most of the other issues, I would be willing to simply accept the disagreement on foreign policy. Moreover, I thought that perhaps it would be a good idea to give Dr. Paul's position an empirical test. If the occupations were successful, I reasoned, it would be possible to conclude them in the near future. So I decided to set up a time frame of my own for how long I would tolerate these occupations occurring. And I said that if by early 2009 the United States had not effectively pacified Iraq and Afghanistan, then it would be time to admit the failure of the occupations, cut our losses, and withdraw. Of course, right now, we are more than a year beyond early 2009. For those occupations, there is no end in sight. So how is it that wars for which the justifications were among the most palatable in human history, for which there was a clear good side and a clear evil side, for which the United States had the best military in the world, and troops who mostly came in with the best intentions, for which the United States had some of the most competent leadership in the world? Why did these occupations fail so miserably? I would argue that it is the nature of war itself that led to such absolute failure.